Yo, what's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Chicago Bears Weekly, a special live stream edition. Today, we are going to, number one, talk about some news that's been going on with the Bears. And two, we're going to definitely tackle the draft class of the Bears that just happened yesterday, Friday, and Saturday. Cover the Bears draft class, talk about some news that actually dropped late last night, which is actually let me make sure everything is going right, going smoothly before I dive into more talk, because I don't want to be like this last stream where it started off black. Let's just make sure everything is running smoothly. Okay, everything is running smoothly. So, first thing is first to discuss with this Bears team. And first thing I want to talk about is that the Bears last night released Nick Foles. Now, my thoughts on that is, to be honest, it was a move that I thought was going to be inevitable because at this point, especially with the offseason and the draft, and a lot of teams have already made their quarterback moves, it was going to be a little bit tough to pull off a trade for Nick Foles. No team was going to take on that salary for him to be a backup. The only teams that could have possibly taken on Nick Foles, I think, were better fits. Actually, I will say maybe two, maybe three different teams. I know Carolina could have been a good fit for him because Carolina has Sam Darnold, and Sam Darnold is it. Nick Foles is a really good bridge quarterback at this point of his career. He's not the same level of player that he was back in 17, 18. It's not the same guy. The organization for the Panthers a little bit in the transition, and the Bears also as well, as the Bears try to transition towards more of a rebuild and try to restructure this roster. And also with that, the Bears are at a point now where Trevor Siemian was signed. And as we know, and Trevor Siemian is at this point the Bears' backup quarterback. So we are at a point right now with this Bears organization is that it's not at the point where they would have been able to take on Nick Foles' salary, but at this same token, a move like this was inevitable. Another team that could have possibly been in discussion is Seattle. Now, if you are not new to this channel or whatever, I'm one that's been not a fan of Drew Lock at all. I don't think Drew Lock is going to be it with the Seattle Seahawks. And it's interesting they didn't take a quarterback in this year's draft. Maybe they could have pulled off a Baker Mayfield trade. Maybe they could have pulled off a trade for Nick Foles. But I don't know what the Seahawks see in Drew Lock. But I do believe that they could have pulled off a trade for Nick Foles, assuming they were willing to take on Nick Foles' contract. But it may be a possible other team could have been the New York Giants to serve as a backup to Daniel Jones. And just in case Daniel Jones struggles, you do have a little bit of insurance plan with Nick Foles. But the Bears are no longer have Nick Foles' services. He was solid for some of the portions while he was here. He only made one start last year. He made a couple of starts in 2020. But overall, with this entire Nick Foles move, to be honest, I wasn't one that necessarily agreed with the entire bringing gig of Nick Foles in the first place, if you want to be honest. I've said possibly that Nick Foles wasn't the guy to bring in. Everybody thought it was all a Trubisky saver, or that he would have been a better fit, or things would have been so much better with Nick Foles than Mitchell Trubisky. But To turn out, things were not. The Bears went on a 6-game losing streak in 2020, and Nick Foles was starting quarterback for majority of that stretch, where the Bears ended up losing 6 straight. Last year, he served as the third string behind Andy Dalton and Justin Fields, and I think the overall trade for Nick Foles was a failure, to be 100% honest, in my opinion. I didn't believe in it to begin with. You were just band-aiding a patch for Mitchell Trubisky, or so-called Mitchell Trubisky, when the whole problem turned out to be Matt Nagy to begin with. So at this point, Bears part ways with Nick Foles. They let him be able to find his home. They were not able to find a trade partner. They were not able to find a guy that they were not able to find a team that could necessarily trade in for him. I really thought somebody may have taken him, but there have been so many quarterback moves this offseason, whether you have Denver's, whether you have Washington trading for Carson Wentz, the Colts traded for Matt Ryan, the Texans traded for trading Deshaun Watson to the Browns. You had a lot of different quarterback moves go on this offseason, and a lot of them happened early on in the offseason, and I think that could have been the best point to unload Nick Foles' contract, but the Bears were unfortunate to do so. But Ryan Poles pulled the classy move, and he was able to let Nick Foles walk out of the door before getting a trade for him. So the next thing I want to talk about is the Bears draft class of this year. Now, the Bears come into this draft class, they needed a lot of things. The Bears needed a lot of things. The Bears come into this draft class, they needed some receiver help to go along with Darnell Mooney. The Bears needed a ton of weapons a ton of pieces on the offensive line. They needed defensive back depth. And I think with this draft class, they addressed a ton of those needs. The Bears, honestly, it's not a team right now that is going to be winning anything much in 2022. Let's just put the cow out of the bag. Let's just call a spade a spade. Let's just call it how it is. The Bears are not a team that is going to be a winning football team in 2022. They do have the pieces and they do have the makings to build this roster. But at this point, especially without the Bears having the first number 1 pick, because they traded it to the Giants for Justin Fields, and I would rather take your franchise-changing quarterback versus just having a first-round pick. So at this point with the Bears, I think they did some smart things with this draft class, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. The Bears did get some players that plugged in and need that they had, especially in the defensive backfield, especially within the front of your offensive line and at the wide receiver position. So this Bears franchise, I think they're heading in the right direction. But before I dive into the draft class, I'm going to talk about the state of the Bears is where they are now. The state of the Bears, where they are now. Obviously, honestly, to be truthful, I like the state the Bears are in right now. The Bears are in a point where they've gotten rid of a couple of bigger contracts that were brought on by Ryan Poles and the whole Ryan Pace and the whole Matt Nagy regime. They got rid of some players that weren't ineffective, like Tariq Cohen. They released a guy like a Danny Trevathan, who was injury plagued most of 2022 or 2021. They traded Khalil Mack. A lot of people might not have agreed with their trade, but at this point, where the Bears stand right now, it was the best move for not only now, but their future to load off of those $23 million that would have counted against the cap if Khalil Mack was still a Bear. Even though I am a huge Khalil Mack fan. I love what he was able to bring into the city of Chicago. I love this tenacity. I loved how he got after the quarterback, but he has some injury issues probably the last 2 seasons, and the Bears are in a transition from a 4-3-4 defense to a 4-3 defense. Even though I think Khalil Mack fits in both, I think he is a better fit for this 3-4 defense than the 4-3, and with bringing in head coach Matt Eberflus, who runs a 4-3. I think he was going to be better off in a 3-4 defense, especially with his injury history, especially at the age he's starting to show a little bit of now. The best move for the Bears was to get rid of the contract, unload those dollars, and really start to rebuild this roster. Because at this point, the patchwork of the Bears has not been proven to work. 2018 is proven more and more to be an absolute fluke season. If you look back at 2018, a lot of things were put into place. A lot of things were brand new, especially on the offensive side of the ball for the Bears. But once teams start to figure out Matt Nagy, and once Matt Nagy started to get in his own ego, things changed. And at this point, 2018 was an absolute fluke, especially on offense. Now, you look at the Bears now, they got a lot of young core pieces. You got Justin Fields as your quarterback. You got a guy like David Montgomery in the backfield. You have a guy that is a really, really good backup running back in Khalil Herbert. You get a guy at Darnell Mooney who's a very young wide receiver. You sign young players in Byron Pringle and an Equinemius St. Brown. You still have an offensive line that needed to be reshuffled and rebuilt. And you have a defense that a lot of the core pieces on the defense are starting to age, and their players starting to dip a little bit. Lawrence Covington, shout out Cuz, says optimistic. I'm optimistic about this Bears team too. It's just at this state now, I think they're heading in the right direction as far as what type of players and what type of pieces they need. They added a lot of young core pieces and pieces that fit the system and free agency, mainly with Eberflus's defense. It's going to be interesting to see what Luke Getsy's offense is going to look like. I think that is the most intriguing thing heading into 2022 is what is this Bears offense going to look like? Is it going to be tailored around the skill set of Justin Fields? But I'm at the point now, this episode is going to be a recap on the Bears draft class and necessarily the how the Bears draft class panned out. Now, like I said before I started this episode, the Bears did not have a first-round pick in this year's draft. They gave it up for Justin Fields in last year's draft. So, honestly, it was only so much that the Bears can do within this draft, and I think they nailed on a couple of picks. Now, the first pick I want to discuss that the Bears had was the pick of Kyla Gordon from Washington. Now, the pick of Kyla Gordon from Washington gives you a lot outside of Jalen Johnson. Jalen Johnson is, I believe, one of the better defensive backs in the league. He might not have the interception numbers and some of the so-called counting stats, but watching him develop into one of the better cover corners that we have in the NFL, this Bears team, honestly enough to be honest, is heading in the right direction with getting Kyla Gordon. Now, Kyla Gordon, I believe, can be a very good shutdown, solid corner, and he's very versatile within this Chicago Bears defense. And I think he was more of a first-round talent and more of a first-round grade that really slipped in the second round, and I think the Bears get great value out of this pick. Because at the end of the day, you have a young corner already in Jalen Johnson, and they really didn't get much that last offseason to replace Kyle Fuller. So you get a guy like Kyla Gordon who can come in and he could be a day one starter right away for this Matt Eberflus Bears defense. You get a guy who can plug and play and be productive right away. And this Bears team is not going to be winning, so he can still develop. He can take his lumps there. And by the time the Bears get everything rolling in 2023, Kyla Gordon is going to be one of those names that's going to be a big part of this Bears future with this defense. He's a long corner. He has long arms. He has very good cover skills. And in addition to that, he can be a good blitz corner off of the edge, which I think the addition of Matt Eberflus's defense, I think he can be better on the edge as a blitzer. And the Bears really didn't have a lot of blitzing as far as the corners go in the last couple of seasons. Maybe from the slot, maybe when you had Buster Screen in the lineup. But overall, shout out to the rapper 10,000. He said that pick is a grade B. I agree with you. The pick for Kyla Gordon, I believe that is a B as well. Very solid player, a player that can come in, step in, and contribute right away to a Bears roster that is still in rebuilding and still in the reshuffling. Let me get to some of these comments. He also asked, do you agree that the Bears, that they should have drafted an offensive lineman or wide receiver with our first pick? Now, we all know the sexier pick is offense, of course. The sexier picks, especially in today's NFL, is offense. But when you look back and you really think of some of the Bears' holes going into this offseason and going into this draft, defensive back, whether it was corner or safety, was another huge hole that the Bears needed to fill. And with the pick of Kyla Gordon, it's not a surprising pick. It might have been surprising to a lot of people because a lot of people were so looking at wide receiver. They were so looking at the offensive line. But when you break it down, corner was a need because outside of Jalen Johnson, the Bears didn't have much. Artie Burns was so-so. Thomas Graham Jr. didn't really get any look until later on in the year. And you had a guy like Kendall Vildor who was really not that great anyway. So you get a guy who can come in, you can plug and play him now. And it's just at this point now to where they are at the point to where you have to get a guy that can be a plug and play player and play now. Because when you think about it, Jalen Johnson was a second-round pick as well. So getting a guy of good value in the second round is going to mean a lot for this Bears defense going forward. So I thought about wide receiver, offensive line first, but I think the Bears made the right move. They stuck to their plan and they went defense. Eric Martin, shout out to you, says, especially with what other teams drafted, we needed to defend them. That is true. The Bears, obviously, if you watched last season, was that the defense needed some really big boosting. So at the end of the day, the Bears did the right point and drafted Kyla Gordon. The rapper 10,000 says, still I would have drafted Bernard Rainman out of Central Michigan with one of our picks. I do see why we went for corner and safety. I mean, I understand us needing an offensive line, but that's nothing you're going to get fixed all in one offseason. I agree you could have went line here, but at this point in time and where the Bears roster stands right now, it's not anything that's going to be fixed all in one offseason. So they did make some moves to get Lucas Patrick. They got Dozier from Minnesota. So I'm not going to say they're wrong for going corner. There's something they could have done, but I like the pick of Gordon. Gives you another corner outside of Jalen Johnson. And I think it's more of a smart pick than a sexier pick of getting the offensive line. So I do like that. But we're going to talk about the next Bears draft pick in the second round, in which they selected at number 39 overall. 48th overall, is that they drafted Jaquan Briscoe out of Penn State. Now, he I think can pair well alongside Eddie Jackson. And hypothetically speaking, if Eddie Jackson really doesn't have that great of a season, he can really be a huge factor in this Bears defense. Now, Jaquan Briscoe is a very physical safety. He's a very aggressive safety, and he's more of a hybrid safety than just a pure free or pure strong safety, which I think that is an element that this Bears defense is missing. A hybrid safety who can play the pass, an hybrid safety who can play in the blitz, of safety who can tackle, because as we know last season, Eddie Jackson was not really tackling much, and he struggled tackling. And Tashawn Gibson was okay, but it was time for to get younger in that position and get a replacement. So he'll have a chance to play immediately. I do like him being a starter outside of Eddie Jackson. And I think that at this point, Jaquan Briscoe is going to play more of a strong safety role because of his versatility. And I think Eddie is going to move back to his natural position and be more of a free safety in this Eberflus defense. Now, I personally, the last 2 seasons without Eddie Jackson, he hasn't really been that great. But I think if he's back at his free safety and he's back to playing with his instincts and using his head versus stuck maybe in some type of a system or opposite side of safety, like to Gibson the last 2 seasons, which I do believe that when he had Adrian Amos in 2018, you've seen the best football from Eddie Jackson. So pairing a guy like Jaquan Briscoe with him, I think can maybe bring a little bit of the younger Eddie out. It is going to be necessarily to be seen if that actually happens. But the Rapper 10,000 says Eddie Jackson will be traded sometime in the future, with Briscoe being traded. Well, I think that all depends on how 2022 goes. If 2022 is at a point where Eddie Jackson he still hasn't got some of those wings under him, he's still not improving his tackling, and still not playing more with those instincts, I think he will be released versus traded, because I don't think there's going to be much value for a safety that hasn't really been in the best play the last 2-3 seasons. And with the contract that they gave him after 2019, I just don't believe that a team is going to necessarily take a chance and take a risk on him via trade. So I think if that happens, he's probably going to be in a Nick Foles similar type of situation where they're probably going to shop him, but I don't know what team is going to take him on. Eric Martin says he's going to be opposite side of Eddie Jackson. I agree. So I don't necessarily believe a trade is going to happen, but just hypothetically speaking, if he doesn't have the best 2022 again, the team could be looking to A, release him, or B, explore trade. But I just don't believe that at this point now Eddie Jackson is going to be outside of the Bears' plans, at least as we stand right now. Still would have drafted. Okay, that was the older comment. But at this point, Jaquan Briscoe, he projects to be starter next to Eddie. And we did bring in Dan Cruikshank as well at free agency. So not only does it add more depth, it adds a bigger physical type of safety, a safety who can play in the box, a safety who can play the pass as well. So you're looking at this Bears defense. I think you're going to be a lot more improved in your defensive backfield with both the picks of Kyla Gordon and Jaquan Briscoe. So I give this pick a B as well. You address a need on your roster. You stuck to your plan. You're not really going for the sexy pick. You're going for what fits your needs, and you're going for what fits your football team. So at this point in time with this Bears roster, I like both the picks of Kyla Gordon and Jaquan Briscoe. So the next pick, the Bears finally addressed a huge need coming into this offseason, which is the drafting of wide receiver Velus Jones from the University of Tennessee. Now, Jones, he brings an element of speed that honestly we had last year, but it wasn't utilized the correct way. And he has great after the catch moves, great after the catch. So he's polished with his hands. He can turn short routes into long gains. And when you think about it, he's going to serve a key role in special teams as well as another weapon for Justin Fields in the speed department. So you're looking at Velus Jones, a guy I believe can have some impact right away, a guy that you can probably fix around on the field. And I think he fills the gap of Jakeem Grant, who left in free agency. Now, I was surprised that the Bears didn't try to bring Jaquan Grant back, but I believe they had some plans to bring in receivers and bring in some speed, which needed in the Bears offense. We already have Darnell Mooney, who's very speedy. Byron Pringle has some speed. Then you bring in a guy like Equanimeous St. Brown, who has size. So I think he adds more of a speed boost to this wide receiver core, who can help take the top off of the defense. He will serve as a huge deep threat in the Chicago Bears offense. He's a developmental receiver being dropped later in the third round, but he can serve a key role as a return on special teams, kind of in that role that Jaquan Grant played last season when we traded for him during the middle of last season. So the Bears get more speed on offense. The rapper 10,000 says, I am not sold on Velus Jones because of his numbers at Tennessee. C+, I will have to see him play. Now, if you guys have been around for this channel, and I'm going to leave this comment up to kind of heighten this point. Numbers may not lie, but I don't believe stats tell the entire story. So guys can have bad stats, don't have the greatest of stats. I'm looking more of the impact on the field. Now, Velus Jones brings speed. Velus Jones brings ability to take the top off the defense. He brings that Jaquan Grant element to this Bears offense and to this Bears roster. So his numbers might not have been the greatest at the University of Tennessee. Also, Tennessee, it's a weird type of an offense that they run there, but you can see his production on the field. You can see that he can change games with a little bit of his route running and his element of breaking speed with his 4.3 speed. And that is another element the Bears need on this roster is speed at the wide receiver positions. And you can use him in all over the field in kind of that, like I said, Jaquan Grant role. Now, of course, there's not going to be the sexy numbers. He has to grab the greatest of stats. I've never been one that's greatest on a stat guy. So I believe Velus Jones could come into this Bears offense and show another element of speed. Currently, there's no replacement for Allen Robinson. We need one. Allen Robinson wasn't much last season to begin with. So we're at the point now, we can't be going to look to replace people that leave. We can't do that every season. We'll just go to replace people, especially since the Bears are in a new offense under Luke Getsy. Yeah, Allen Robinson served great roles in 19 and 20. 2021 wasn't his best season, and I believe that was more of the system than it was Allen Robinson himself. But at the same token, you're not going to get replacements right away because you look at this Bears roster, like I've said before I started evaluating this draft, that the Bears are not in a position that you are going to win right now. You are at the point with this Bears roster where you need to develop guys. Plan out your system, put your system in play, see how things work. If the Bears, I think the biggest mistake for this Bears roster, it would be to have success like 2018 in year one, especially in the plan that you're going to build this roster slowly. If you have a 2018 like style season in 2022, could that hinder the franchise, especially when your plan has been to go out to second and third tier free agents and build this roster from ground up? So it's not a replacement for Allen Robinson now, but you need guys to fit your system. You need guys that you can develop, and that can be big contributors for you when you're ready to kick the notch up and start to actually build a winning roster right away. Are you impressed with draft overall? I've gotten into that. Some of the first couple of picks I've been impressed with. I'm on Velus Jones now. But speaking of Velus Jones, I'm going to go to the next pick that the Bears had in this 2022 NFL draft. And the Bears selected their first offensive lineman in this draft. And they selected Braxton Jones, a tackle out of Utah. Now, the Bears offensive line, let's just face it, was trash. I tried to find another word to call it, but it was trash. The Bears' offensive line last season was trash. And you get a guy with Braxton Jones who both played left and right tackle during his career at Southern Utah, but he was primarily a left tackle. Yeah, you get it from a small school, a FCS school, but he has prototypical size for a tackle with being a 6'5", 310 with 35-inch arms. Now, you're going to say he's a small school player. He's going to have a development, which is true. The Southern Utah had a run scheme. They had a really good run scheme, and he was a very good run blocker. So I see him transition into maybe possibly a right tackle role if you were to slide Larry Borom inside, which I believe that could be a plan with this new offensive coordinator. But at this same token, you're looking at the Chicago Bears roster that you need a lot of offensive line help. A lot of the Bears' offensive line was not good at all. It was not good. You had last year, you had Borom, who was in and out of the lineup due to injury. Jason Peters dealt with some injuries, but he was also older in the two. You had James Daniels, who was in and out and had some bad and good moments. Mustipher. You had Cody White here, who wasn't really necessarily that great. I think it was your best lineman, but the offensive line still struggled. And you had the trash bag, in my opinion, in Jermaine Fatty. So Braxton Jones, I think he's going to transition more to a right tackle, especially being that he's a very good run blocker. He's better at run blocking than he is at pass protection, especially coming from a Southern Utah offense, which ran the ball heavily in a zone scheme. So he does have a lot of size for a tackle. He's very strong. He has long arms. And I think he could develop to a starter at some point. I don't think he's going to be a starter right away unless you possibly move a guy like Larry Borom aside. But at the same token, you did add Lucas Patrick in your interior. You add Dakota Dozier from Minnesota to help out with your offensive line as well. Even though the offensive line still needs help, I think he can come in and be solidified and play a solid role for this Bears offense on the offensive line. So I give the grade of Braxton Jones, I'll give it a B-. He could be a very good steal on your offensive line, but time will tell. I think he still has some time to develop. He still has some room to develop as far as a full-blown left tackle, if that was the option. I don't think it will be with Tevin Jenkins. I think it's going to secure that left side. So let me get a little bit to these comments. The Rapper 10,000, just beating Green Bay in a losing season. Yeah, as fans, I wish that would happen. I wish it would, because I'm actually so sick and tired of losing to Green Bay. But, yeah, I agree with you as I check a couple of messages. I just believe that, let's see, there we go. I think that Ryan Poles needs to pay attention to wide receivers from SMU, Georgia, and Miami of Ohio, because those are gems. No. The draft is already over, but I think one name they could possibly get, though, is Justin Ross. Justin Ross has some injury history at Clemson, but I'm surprised that man went undrafted. I'm actually surprised that Justin Ross went undrafted this year. So that could be a name that could possibly be looked to in the undrafted free agency pool. He says B+ on Braxton Jones, or possibly still. I can agree with that. As long as he's developed right, I think that could be a possible steal for the Bears on the offensive line. Yeah, that O-line was atrocious. Couldn't block for 5 seconds. And I think the Cleveland Brown game really started to expose more of the holes in this Bears pass protection and this Bears offensive line. I still think the offensive line pick should have been addressed earlier on, but I can see good possibilities here. I mean, we all have our differences. I think offensive line could have been addressed earlier on, but this was a draft class of offensive linemen that was pretty deep. And even though the wide receiver class is pretty deep as well, I think the Bears hit the right move of getting their 2 corners and 2 defensive back players early, because it really wasn't the deeper draft class as far as your corners and your defensive backfield goes. So if you're able to get first-round grade talent, especially with a guy like Kyla Gordon, earlier in the draft, you go get that guy, especially a pair opposite of a guy like Jalen Johnson. And you also need a guy opposite side of Eddie Jackson. So Jaquan let me get his name right. You guys know I'm bad with names. Jaquan Briscoe. I almost said something else. Jaquan Briscoe, getting him in the second round to pair with Eddie Jackson. I believe you get your defensive backs earlier, especially in a class in this year where your defensive backfield wasn't really that great. You could have gotten tackles later. But okay, so we're going to go into our next pick for the Bears draft. And the Bears' next draft pick wasn't until the 5th round at 174 overall. When you get a guy and Dominique Robinson, who was on the edge from Miami of Ohio. Now the Bears, they could have used some depth at the edge, especially with the departures of guys like Bilal Nichols, Akeem Hicks, the departure of Khalil Mack, of course. So the Bears could use some help on the defensive side of the ball at your edge rusher spot, and Dominique Robinson brings that to the Chicago Bears defense. He was a converted wide receiver in college, being at 6'4", 250. He's incredibly athletic, but at the same time, he is inexperienced due to his being converted to wide receiver, but he still has a high ceiling, and he's only played the pass rusher position for 2 years. So you think once he gets fully developed, I think is going to get a chance of really to see him take off. A 41-inch vert, especially for a guy that's 6'4", 250, is very impressive. He's going to be a developmental edge rusher. Of course, you're going to have a guy like Robert Quinn, and you got Travis Gibson, who had some really solid moments for the Bears last season. So this Bears defense gets more depth as far as the edge rushers go. They get more on your defensive line depth, which is another hole that could have been addressed. Even though you bring in Justin Jones in free agency, you were close to bringing in a guy like Larry Ogunjobi, but that ended up failing out. So you do get some more depth. You get Al-Quadin Muhammad as well, a guy that was a good edge rusher, a good player for the Indianapolis Colts. You brought him in as well. So adding more defensive line depth, especially with a guy like Khalil Mack being gone, you can I think deeper rotations as far as your defensive line goes well into keeping your guys fresh. And a guy like Dominique Robinson, who's very athletic, he's still raw talent. He still has some developing to do. So he doesn't have to come in and play the role right away. And I give this grade a C as well. It's not necessarily a sexy pick, but it does address a need, which is edge rushing and the depth along your front four. So let's go a little bit more into these comments. Kyla Gordon and Jaquan Briscoe beast. Excited to see them play. I agree with you there. The Rapper 10,000 says this 5th round defensive end is a steal, C+, and might replace Akeem Hicks. Reminds me of Peppers and Dan Hampton. I wouldn't go that far. 2 Hall of Fame players, but I can see where you're coming from. Thank God we got some depth on our secondary. Everybody except JJ sucks. I could agree with you there. But that's why I was saying earlier that the Bears did right by going corner and safety with your first 2 picks versus just addressing fans wants an offense. You address your actual needs as a football team and you go defensive back, and those 2 holes were big last season. So getting back on Dominique Robinson, the edge rusher for Miami in the 5th round, 174th overall, I think you can get a guy come in and develop and be a situational player until he starts to develop more outside of guys like maybe a guy, let's see, Brian Ivan, who we have on the team, is not the same as not Brian Ivan, the same as with Seahawks. I think you might be thinking Bruce or Brian Ivan. I think he's not that good. So the Bears roster right now, they needed some more defensive line depth. Let me get this thing straightened out. Okay, that's done. Sorry guys, this is addressing some. Okay, so you get this Bears roster that you had some holes in your defense. You got a transition from a 3-4 to a 4-3, and you're going to need pieces that fit. Dominique Robinson is a piece that fits more of an edge rusher than he does anything else. So I believe him again at this place is a very good pick. I give him a C for this pick. I give the Bears a C for the pick of Dominique Robinson on your defense. You have front seven that definitely needed some addressing. So I give this pick a C. The next pick, the Bears get another offensive lineman, another hole in the lineup. You get a guy like Zach Thomas from the University of San Diego State, a 4-year starter there. He's has some great athleticism in the zone run scheme, which with the drafting of him and as well as the drafting of a guy like Braxton Jones, both offensive linemen that come from a zone run scheme, it seems like Luke Getsy's offense is going to be a zone run scheme type of offense, especially with a guy like David Montgomery who has very good vision, Khalil Herbert who has very good vision. You're going to need some line that's going to be very good in the zone blocking scheme. You get a guy like Zach Thomas, who's a 4-year starter at San Diego State. He comes in 6'4", 308. He's a typical zone blocking lineman, which a lot of zone blocking linemen are usually a little bit smaller in size, but a little bit more athletic as far as your zone blocking scheme goes because of the mobility that they have to have because they're not necessarily stationary offensive lines. So you're going to a guy, Zach Thomas, who can just add more depth to your offensive line. And if he does get the occasional chance to start, I think he can project well. He projects more as a guard, in my opinion, versus a tackle, especially with him being smaller in size, especially with him being as mobile as he is. I think he's going to fit better on the inside of your offensive line versus on the outside of your offensive line. So you're at a point now where the Bears are still in your zone blocking scheme. He does have to develop his pass protection, and he adds a lot of speed as far as offensive line and quickness and explosion out of his stance, but he does need to get better in pass protection. But they do get a solid depth piece, and that's what you're going to get in the later rounds as far as your offensive line goes. You're going to get solid depth pieces to help build your offensive line, whether he's projected to be somewhat of a backup or a spot starter or a guy who comes in with different packages, maybe your jumbo package, your goal line package. But a guy like Zach Thomas, who is smaller, but he fits a zone run scheme, does help. And let me get back to some of these comments. Yeah, you was talking about Bruce Irvin. I still think linebacker will be a near concern in the future. I believe even with the sign of Nicholas Morrow from the Raiders, they maybe could have addressed linebacker. But I think that's something they may address next offseason. The Bears fans are freaking out about Foles drafting the face of players. If you're helping out your defense, you're helping out your quarterback so he's not constantly on the field having to pass. Great point. I love that comment. Great point. You have to address – you can't always address offense. If your defense has holes, you have to fix them. You have to fix your defense as well. You can't. We are not in 100% the offensive league. Yeah, you win games by scoring points, but defense wins championships. Defense wins championships. Who just won the last 2 Super Bowls? The Rams and the Buccaneers. They have good offenses, but they were complemented by very good defenses. You can't score all the points in the world with a bad defense. It's going to catch up to you, i.e. Kansas City. So I love that comment. You have to help out your defense. My cousin, shout out Lawrence. I'm not even going to read this comment. Nope. I won't be coming at my Buckeye guys like that. I think Ryan posted a decent job in his first draft, filling holes of what we needed. Give him a B+. I can agree he addressed holes that we needed. The Rapper 10,000 says Zach Thomas is a right tackle. I don't believe so, especially with him being a little bit smaller in stature. with him being stronger, but he's smaller, and he's going to be an athletic type of offensive lineman. So I believe he's more of a guard, especially with the small size of six, being in a guy like 6'4", 308. He's a little taller, but as far as weight, he's a little bit smaller, and usually the smaller guys at this point, maybe 308, 305 to 320 is usually inside, the interior, especially with the athleticism he brings. But Tevin Jenkins, I think, is your left tackle right now. And I honestly think a guy like Braxton Jones has projection more to be a tackle than Zach Thomas does, in my opinion. But you're thinking about this Bears offensive line. It just needed restructure, period. Even though they brought in Lucas Patrick inside, you bring in Dozier. But this is a really nice pick for the Bears for Zach Thomas. I'm going to give this a C as well. I do like the pick. You address your offensive line depth. You address a hole that we all seen was just evident last season. But let me quickly get to these next couple of picks before we get into the hour mark on this stream. And the next pick that the Bears were able to make, I know Ryan Poles made a couple of trades to get back in these later rounds, but the Bears picked running back Tristan Egner, a guy out of Baylor. Now, it was surprising that the Bears were running back here, especially with you having a guy like David Montgomery and Khalil Herbert on your roster, but you really don't have too much outside of him, so he's just going to add more depth. He adds versatility out of the backfield. He has 4.4 speed. He's a sixth-round running back compared to last year's Khalil Herbert and Darrington Evans that they brought in free agency. He's able to catch the ball out of the backfield. He could be another piece that Luke Getsy spreads around in his offense and use in different roles. You can use him out of the backfield. You can use him in the slot. The Bears get a versatile athlete who can be a contributor. He was really explosive at special teams, and I think that could be the main reason that the Bears drafted him. In college, he got 3 kick returns for touchdowns. That is another element that the Bears needed to address, was their special teams and getting some explosive plays, not only just from your punt return game, which I think Velus Jones can come in and play, and Byron Pringle as well. But you get another one in Tristan Egner, who can come in and fill in for some special teams roles as well, with his 4.4 speed coming out of running back and out of Baylor. So you think about this Bears special teams, Jaquan Grant was gone, and even 2020 they tried with Ted Ginn Jr., but that did not work out. The Bears were missing explosiveness on special teams, especially with Tariq Cohen tearing his ACL and not playing in 2021. Wish Tariq Cohen would have filled those roles as far as getting explosiveness out of your special teams. But at the end of the day, I was a little bit surprised that they were running back, but once I started to look more of why they were drafted Tristan Egner, it made more sense. I was surprised that they drafted a running back late, that there were people on board. But when you think about it, I think he's going to be more of a special teams role, and we lose a special teams guy like a Jaquan Grant when he signed with the Cleveland Browns. And for the last couple of seasons, the Bears have struggled on special teams. Ever since the injury of Tariq Cohen, the Bears have struggled on special teams to really get explosive and significant yardage, significant field position changes out of the special teams game. Even though Cordell Patterson did have his moments, but I just think the Bears, especially in the punt return game, they struggled a lot. And I think the additions of Velus Jones and the additions of a guy like a Egner helps in those departments as well. So the Bears, I'm giving this one a C. I was a little bit shy, just like you were, that they ended up taking a running back late. But at the end of the day, the Bears needed help on their special teams. And I think he's going to play more of a special teams role and a little bit of a spot duty role on offense than anything. But with the next pick in the Bears draft, they select Doug Kramer, an offensive lineman out of Illinois. So that is the third offensive lineman taken for the Bears in this draft, which he was a center in college. Like I said before, the previous two linemen and guys like Braxton Jones and guys like Zach Thomas, they fit a zone blocking scheme. In Kramer, Illinois, they were a zone blocking team. He's a bit more slimmer, but he is a very athletic offensive lineman as well. And it seems like the Bears have a pattern with him being an offensive line, with them being smaller in stature, but they could be more athletic, especially if you're going to run a zone blocking scheme. You need offensive linemen that can be able to move. And Kramer is just another one of those pieces. He was a 5-year starter during his career at Illinois, but he primarily played the center position, which Lucas Patrick is going to show up for this Bears team now. He could maybe develop as a future starter at center, but he's just a depth option right now behind Lucas Patrick. And he said he was talking about Tristan Ebner, could he move to wide receiver? Possibly. I think that might be a thing. He can move to wide receiver. It has some spot duty in the backfield as well. I think he's just going to be more of a flexible type of a player when you're talking about this Bears roster. So at the end of the day, it is more about flexibility for him. He's waiting on. I don't hate Illinois. Stop it. I don't hate Illinois. But I do like the fact that Doug Kramer can come in, add depth behind Patrick. He's very athletic at the center spot. And the Bears have gone the route of getting athletic linemen. Seems like Lou Getsy is going to run more of a zone blocking scheme in his offense. And he's just another depth piece to add to your offensive line. And the Bears went offensive lineman again. That will be their fourth taken off the board with their next pick. As the Bears ended up, as I can get this right, as the Bears ended up selecting Jatier Carter, a guy out of Southern. A guy out of Southern who, again, played in his own blocking scheme. He's a little thinner. He had left tackle in college, but I believe he's going to transition more to a guard. 6'3", 311. He's going to transition more to a guard, former basketball player. He's a developing prospect, and you're going to get more developing prospects, especially in the 7th round of this draft, of any draft. But he might not become a starter in his NFL career, I believe, but he can provide some depth behind Dozier and Cody White here at guard, which at this point, we all know Ryan Poles is a former offensive lineman, so he values offensive linemen a lot more than others. And speaking of the Kramer, the Rapper 10,000 said, does Kramer needs to put on more muscle to be on the center and applause. He's a run blocker. I want to see him work with the Bears. It has been a long time since the Bears drafted a player from Illinois. I wanted Juice Williams and the Bears in 2010. And we had Jay Cutler in, and we all know how that went, but we're not going to go there. But drafting a Jatier Carter, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, just adding more depth to this Bears offensive line. They get him from Southern or HBCU, which honestly as a black man, that makes me happy. Get an HBCU player to get drafted in this draft. So at this point, adding depth to your offensive line can never, ever hurt. Never. Especially if he turns out to be productive depth, maybe spot starter, maybe come in, maybe injuries or so lot that happens. I'm fine with it. It's a very solid pick. I give this one a C as well. Hopefully you get some value for your team late, not value on draft boards or everybody else's draft boards. You get value for your football team. And I really love the fact that he got value for this football team. So the next pick, the Bears draft in the 7th round, 254th overall, Elijah Hicks. He's a versatile back who can play some box safety, which he adds more depth to your safety spot, which was a hole with this Bears defense. He could probably play you a little spot corner, but he's probably going to be more of a special team safety. He's going to add more depth, carve a role out for himself, maybe similar to a guy like DeAndre Houston Carson. So Elijah Hicks, strong, physical safety, but he's probably going to be more of a special team player on this Bears roster. He could probably show what he can do. We'll see more in the preseason. He can show himself to be more of a physical added depth. And he might play a couple of games to start or injuries is like that. So you're going to add more depth to your safety spot, which is a big, big question mark. Let's just go to the comments. The guy Carter might go to guard, which I agree with. We have to see how his blocking is. Last night I prayed Geronimo Allison. The name sounds familiar. And speaking of Cody White should move to guard. I agree. Lucas Patrick is probably going to be your center. And Cody White I think he's more naturally a guard than he is a center. Lucas Patrick played center during his time in Green Bay. So I think moving Cody White to guard, I think that's more about of his depth. But now, I'm not sure about this Elijah Hicks this late. The Bears needed more safety depth. They needed more depth at the Bears in the safety position. So at the end of the day, you can't go wrong with depth, especially in a position of need. And if you get a guy of quality value late in the second round, why not do so? And the last pick that the Bears made in this draft was a punter. Trenton Gill basically comes in to replace a guy like Pat O'Donnell, who left the free agency to sign with them damn Green Bay Packers. But Pat O'Donnell left the free agency, so he's just going to be the guy that comes in and replaces him. He can compete with a starting job, who the Bears have Ryan Winslow currently on the roster as well, so they just add him to compete. Has a great leg, a solid leg. So I think the Bears might end up adding another punter at some point down the road. But this was just as a sure position. Pat O'Donnell left the free agency. So the Bears draft overall, I'm going to give the Bears draft grade for this year's draft. I am going to give the Bears, I'm going to give them a B. I'm going to give the Bears a B for this entire draft. Now, we might not have went wide receiver early. We might not have went offensive line early. But you do address needs. You do address your corners. You do address the safety. You get depth on your offensive line. You get Velus Jones, who's had speed at the wide receiver position. He can be a very versatile player in your Luke Getsy new offense. You do add Tristan Egner, a guy who can contribute on special teams, a guy who can be more versatile in your offense as well. You do get a punter in the draft, which you get another filler to replace Pat O'Donnell. You get an edge rusher who could add depth from Dominique Robinson, a position that also has some need for the Bears. As far as adding depth on your defensive line, so you can keep the rotation fresh, keep Robert Quinn fresh for his main pass rushing situations as your main pass rushers. Let me go, you guys' thoughts on the draft class down below. What are your grades? Any steals you see in this class? I think I'm going to say between Kyla Gordon is a steal for where he was drafted at because he was a first-round talent. Velus Jones can be a steal if he's a versatile player, if he's using that versatile role. And I think Tristan Egner could be a steal in this draft as well, as far as special teams and his ability to change games in that department and his versatility on your offense. It just adds another weapon to pair along with Justin Fields and his development. So I think the biggest steal is Kyla Gordon, especially from where they picked him. But I will say between Velus Jones and between a guy like Braxton Jones could be, I think, the Bears' biggest steals in this draft. I think Velus Jones, for his dynamic speed and adding more speed to this Bears offense, never is going to hurt. And I think the factor that Luke Getsy is going to put them in positions to succeed is going to be one thing. I hope that happens. So the steals, I believe, is going to be Kyla Gordon, Velus Jones, and I think Braxton Jones could be somewhat of a steal. Tristan Egner could be somewhat of a steal if he produces at the level that is going to be productive towards your special teams and productive towards your offense. James Daniels, our center from Iowa. James Daniels is no longer on the Bears. James Daniels signed with, I want to say, Pittsburgh. James Daniels he started in Pittsburgh now. Eric Martin, I give Ryan a B for the draft and a plus for acquiring the extra picks. You can never go wrong with acquiring extra picks late, especially with the Bears needing more depth on this roster. So I give him an A for the effort of acquiring more picks and adding more depth to this roster, which the Bears roster needed some depth. So, and I think this is what this offseason was more about than anything, was adding depth to all your positions, whether it was your offensive line, whether it's your running back room, whether it's your wide receiver room, whether it's your defensive back room, your linebacker room. I just think adding depth was the key factor in this offseason for Ryan Poles. So overall, I give this Bears draft grade a B. I give it a B. Let me know you guys agree. I see 3 of our offensive lineman picks going to start. Kyla Gordon and the Penn State safety Jaquan Briscoe steals. I believe so as well. I think Kyla Gordon is going to be more of a steal because of his first round grade potential and him dropping towards the second. And it could be steals overall as far as the whole draft goes because of the production that they can have in this Bears defense. With that being a position of need, then they can come in and contribute to this Bears football team right away. I see the Bears will start some undrafted free agents who will surprise people. I can believe so as well. This Bears team, I've said it many times before this offseason, it's not going to be a team that's going to be competing for the playoffs. It is not going to be a football team that's going to be competing for a playoff spot. If it happens, I will be happy about it because, of course, we want to see the Bears win. But we're going to keep things realistic. This Bears team is not going to be a team that's going to be competing for a playoff spot. Green Bay is still, I believe, the cream of the crop. Minnesota has a step or two above the Bears, especially on the offensive side of the ball for Minnesota goes. But at this point, if the Bears, I'm going to touch on a little bit before I end this stream. And the rapper 10,000, he says it's a B for this draft. Now my prediction, I'm going to touch on my predictions before I conclude this stream. My Bears 2022 predictions, with all the additions that they've made, with all the things that they've done, my Bears 2022 predictions, I don't see this team winning more than 7 games. I do not see the Bears winning more than 7 games. This Bears team, it still has a lot of growing to do. It still has a lot of developing to do. Justin Fields still has a lot of room to develop. You still have an offensive line who needs to get cohesive with one another. You still have a brand new system, offense and defense. Your roster is going into a lot of transition. You have a defense that's transitioning to from a 3-4 to a 4-3. You have an offense that is going to finally be away from Matt Nagy. You have a young developing quarterback in Justin Fields. You have a potential 1-2 very good pairing in Fields and Darnell Mooney. You still have a lot of weapons on offense that you need to acclimate to the offense. You have Luke Getsy's coming in from the Green Bay Packers that you have to get acclimated to his system. So at this point, I don't see the Bears being no more than a 7-10 football team. But with that 7-10 record, I believe, you are going to see the Bears develop players. You're going to see them develop for 2023 with a lot of the young players that the Bears brought in, especially in this draft with Briscoe, especially in this draft with Egner, with Velus Jones, Braxton Jones, Dominic Robinson. You've got guys like Byron Pringle who brings speed, Equanimeous St. Brown who brings value, Lucas Patrick, Dakota Dozier. You have Alquanine Muhammad, Nicholas Morrow. You have a lot of younger guys. You have some that has some experience, but they're still younger as far as NFL years. So and Eric Mark, we're not even mentioning the undrafted free agents they're creating. That effect, I need to go look that up now. I know one for sure that it might be a little biased pick for me. That they signed my guy. I almost said Eugene. That they signed my guy. I cannot get his name out. From Ohio State. Master Teague. So they get Master Teague in free agency. They sign Chase Allen out of Iowa State and undrafted. Ali Green from Missouri. They get Jack Sanborn, a linebacker from Wisconsin. They get Kyle tight end Jake Tungus. They get Kevin Shaw from Liberty, a teammate of Malik Willis's. They get another wide receiver, Savon Scarver, out of Utah State. And I believe they should go get Justin Ross. That's just my opinion. They get another defensive back in Jalen Jones and Ole Miss. They get a guy like Landon Lenore, a receiver out of Southern Illinois. They get Jamal Brooks out of South Alabama with rookie camp. C.J. Avery, linebacker from Louisville. You get Henry Litton from Slippery Rock. I don't even know. I've never heard of that school until just today. Jonathan Alexander from Charlotte. Jalen Alexander from Purdue. Tristan Taylor, which brings more offensive depth from Eastern Washington. You get defensive lineman Micah Treadway from Minnesota. You get Antonio Ortiz from TCU, but that's a long snapper. But he's not. He's going to be invited to camp. Defensive lineman Joshua Black from Syracuse. Running back DeMontre Tuggle from Ohio. You get another kicker to bring into camp in Mike Conklin out of Michigan State. You get Ezekiel Barnett, a linebacker from Louisiana Tech. Cyrus Holder from Duquesne. Defensive lineman Kiona Favera from Western Michigan. You get quarterback Drew Plitt from Ball State. You get Coney Dern from Minnesota. So the Bears added a lot as far as rookie mini camp. They got a lot as far as just to add more guys to help compete this offseason. But the one name that stands out for me, and my biasness is going to hit, is a guy like Master Teague from Ohio State. Now, I could personally speak on him because I watched him to play at Ohio State. I watched him develop. He's more of a physical type of running back. He's more of a bell cow running back. He doesn't have a lot of speed, but he's strong and he has a really, really solid build. Why did the Pats get a quarterback when they got Mac? It's all about depth. It's all about depth. If you got a quarterback and you can get some depth at that position, it might as well get depth. It's all about depth when you get into later rounds. And Lawrence, my cousin, says Teague is null 2.0. And Elijah Feingen says, I think Doug Kramer could be good, but we're an hour in. My Bears 2022 predictions as we stand right now, I think there's going to be a 7-win football team, but a 7-win football team that has a chance to get into better in 2023. I think you're going to see more progression from Justin Fields. You're going to see more progression as the season goes along with this Matt Eberflus defense. Everything is not going to turn around for this Bears team in year one under a new regime, a complete new regime. But I think you're going to see steps in this Bears roster and this Bears football team that you could develop to 2023. And I think that's when Ryan Poles is going to start going after those tier free agents. When he has a plan in place, he has his system in place, he has everything that he needs, and he has free agent flexibility. So I think at this point, the Bears are going to be a 7-win football team. But that's going to conclude it for this episode of Chicago Bears Weekly. Thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you guys for contributing in the chat. And the last thing I said, the Bucs need to be able to win a natty with all the talent they acquire. I agree that'll be another subject for a different day. As a Buckeye fan myself, but drop you also. I can split. Whatever that is. But at the end of the day, that is going to conclude this episode of Chicago Bears Weekly. Thank you guys for tuning in. And I appreciate the love and support that you guys have shown on this channel. over the past couple of years that I've been doing it or everything like that. And another episode of Weather will be dropping later on today. I've already recorded it. I woke up a little late this morning. Had a rough week. Had some extra sleep. So episode of Weather will be coming soon. I'll see you guys in the next video. And peace.